And not only has he had an interest since a very early age, but from the very beginning, the most wonderful and unique thing about Wendell is that he has been willing to share the knowledge that he learns with everybody and anybody who asks him. And this is so wonderful and so special and so rare. And tonight, he is coming to share a little bit of this knowledge with all of us again, yet again. You know, I think Wendell has probably forgotten more things than most of us will ever know about this subject. And I don't, I mean that in the best possible way. And it's a rare treat tonight because he's going to talk on a subject that, in truth, for the last, 8 or 10 years anyway, it's a subject that he has been reluctant to continue talking about. He says, the Meier case, the Palladian case, that's old news. We did that investigation, years ago. I've said everything I have to say on it. And that's pretty much where he's left it, and he's moved on to newer stuff. Now, there are generations of people that are now interested in the phenomena, and many of them really don't know much about the Billy Meier case. And in addition, there's now a big move afoot to debunk it. Oh, yeah. Yes, there is. Well, yeah, there always has been, but there's another new, fresh, orchestrated attempt at, I would say, almost professionally debunking the Meier case. And two of the people behind this position, that the Meier case is a hoax, are Cal Korff and Glenn Hoyen. Thank you, Wendell. Drew a blank there. Yeah, Cal Korff and Glenn Hoyen. Now, I want to let everybody here know that both of these gentlemen were invited to be a part of this retrospective. As a matter of fact, in the beginning, I had an idea for this really to be more of a structured debate between the current generation of debunkers and those people that were really there on scene, those people that really did the work, etc. But the other side, if we can, the debunking side, for whatever reason, is not here. Now, that alone may say something to some of us. It says something to me, for sure. Cal Korff had, at least up until the last week or so, been talking like he was going to come, even when we changed the format to a retrospective, because without the other side officially accepting the debate challenge, why we couldn't set it up in that kind of format. But Cal Korff also had a change of heart in the last few days, and he cited a pressing schedule for the reason he could not be here. But an event happened a couple of days before we got a declination from him. The television program Sightings is also doing a report on the Meier case, and I believe that will be aired, if it's not this Sunday, maybe the following, but very quickly now. And Cal Korff and Jim Della Tosa, this Sunday, thank you. Jim Della Tosa, who was also scheduled to be a part of the retrospective tonight, and Cal Korff actually were in kind of a mini debate format during the filming for Sightings. And I'm told by people that were on those crews and by the producer of that program that Cal Korff literally got blown out of the water. Literally. And my suspicion is that this is the real reason that he may not be with us tonight. So, a brief word about Jim Della Tosa. Jim was the man that did the original photographic analysis on the Meier photos and negatives. And unfortunately, he had planned to be with us tonight, but I do know that for a fact that he has a major negotiation going on with Lucasfilms, Industrial Light and Magic right now, and some other very big Hollywood players on a couple of projects. And this is, of course, his livelihood now. Regretfully, he is not with us tonight, but we do have his sincere apologies to convey to all of you that he's not here. He is, of course, the head of the UFO band who will be performing for us in concert on Saturday night. So you all will get a chance to meet Jim. And if any of you want to talk to him personally about the photographic analysis on the Meier photos, I'm certain that he will be equally receptive to speaking to any of you on an individual basis. So listen, I've talked much longer than I should have here, but I wanted to give you some background on this whole evening. And right now I'm going to bring Colonel Wendell Stevens up, and please give him a great round of applause.
Can you hear me okay? First of all, I want to thank you all for coming to this meeting tonight. As Bob said, the thing changed quite a bit, so I threw my prepared lecture and notes out, and I'm going to do this extemporaneously. So I'm going to start from the beginning of the case and go from there and tell you details that have never been published anywhere and events that happened in sequential order as best I can remember them. So with that, Pleiades almost seems like an unpleasant word today, the way it's abused and bandied around and misused, but it's a very important word. The Pleiades are a very prominent star group in our history and mythology. Everything mentions the Pleiades someplace or other. It's in all of the mythological lore of all of the countries of the world, as a matter of fact. So, did this Meier case that is so controversial, did it start with Billy Meier? No. His case didn't start there, and there were other cases of visitors, human beings, coming here from the Pleiades before Mr. Meier's case with them started in 1975. In 1958, there was a man named Lloyd Zerbes up at St. Cloud, Minnesota, who began having contacts with beings who said they came from the Pleiades. And his contacts went on until about 4 years ago when he died of a cancer. And they went on all that time, and these Pleiadians conveyed a lot of information to him. He never wanted to get any public attention. They gave him technical data. They discussed physics and science, many sciences with him, very much like they did with the ones in Switzerland with Billy Meier. The Pleiadians that were visiting Minnesota were not the same Pleiadians as the one visiting Meier. Now, the word Pleiadians was our reference to that group. They have another name for themselves. We call them Pleiadians because they said they came from a star group that we call the Pleiades. Very apt name. The same thing with the others. The others came from the Pleiades, but they came from different star systems in the Pleiades. When we finally tied down the source of the Pleiadians visiting Switzerland, they said they came from a star that we call Taygeta. It's about the fourth brightest star in the 7 bright stars that make up the Pleiades. The case in Minnesota, in that case, the Pleiadians said that they came from a star group that around the major star that we call Alcyone. There's another Pleiadian group that said they came from a star, or human beings that come from what we call the Pleiades, said they came from a system around the star Merope. There was a Pleiadian case in South America involving an attorney, Enrique Castillo Rincon, who participated in a metaphysical study group, and at a beginning first with telepathic contact and then going on from there with some sightings. And then they were invited telepathically to to choose a representative in that group for a meeting with those human beings who said they came from the Pleiades. Now, they didn't tell them initially this. This came out in the discussions later. But they chose Enrique Castillo Rincon to represent the group, and he followed the instructions, went out into a remote area south of Colombia, about 12 miles south of Bogota, Colombia, and met human beings who got out of a big spaceship and talked to him. They invited him aboard, and he went, and he had several subsequent visits aboard the spacecraft. That's another entire story in itself, and that began in the middle 60s, also before the contacts with Billy Meier began. So those are 3 cases. There are a couple more that I am aware of, and 2 of them began before the Meier case. So we can't say that they are copying Billy Meier. we might say that he's copying them, but he was not there, and the information on 2 of those cases was never published. So, the thing of interest here is, when did it all begin? It looks to me like the Meier case didn't start with the Pleiades. It started with another group that identified him when he was, actually, there's evidence that it started when he was a baby, when he was dying of pneumonia in the crib, and he was given up for dead. The doctor left, said he won't live until morning. And miraculously, he was breathing well in the morning, and he had almost fully recovered. Later, the Pleiadians mentioned their saving his life at that time. He didn't know anything about this, of course. And when they mentioned it to him, he went back and asked his parents if there was something strange about the early days of his birth, and they told him yes, he had a miraculous survival. So that was the first clue that he got that there was direct interference in his life. At about the age of 8, there was a direct contact where he and his father saw an object pass a disc-shaped object pass at low level over a field where they were working. He asked his father about it, and his father said, "Oh, it must be one of those new German weapons." They live right across the border from Germany. They could see the bombers bombing the city right across, and they wrote it off. But he thought that couldn't be the case because it was huge. It was a large disc flying at low level. Then later, a few years later, when he was about 10 or 11 years old, now he's seen things in the sky ever since. He got to where he could look up, and he could see them in the daylight in the deep sky. He could look through the blue and see them up there, and he knew they were there. And then he saw them at night also. Then another close approach, and a pear-shaped metallic, silvery gold metallic craft landed in a field in front of him. The door opened, and an old man got out and invited him to come aboard. And he did at that time, and when he got in the ship, he noticed that they took off because the ground receded from them, but he wasn't afraid. The old man talked to him very gently, and he set him down in a chair there, in a seat, put a helmet of some kind over his head, a big helmet with lights and wires and things going into it, lights on it. And in a few minutes' time, they inculcated a vast amount of knowledge in his head, just pumped in somehow into his subconscious mind. And then after that happened, triggering events would awaken realization of some of these things that he knew, but he didn't know how he knew them. So with the knowledge that was instilled in his mind, he was able to attend school, although he attended very seldom because he was the poorest, among the poorest of the boys in the school. And because he didn't have shoes and he didn't have new clothes and things for school, the more affluent boys picked on him, and they would set him up as the butt of pranks. They would pull a joke on the teacher, make it look like Meier did it, and he would frequently get punished for it. And the time came when this seemed to be a regular thing, and the boys took pride in getting it over on Meier. He began to think, well, if the teacher can't see through this, and the boys are getting away with it, then I really am superior to them because I know both. I know they're doing it, and I know the teacher doesn't understand this, and he'd take his punishment and say nothing. But because of this, he didn't go to school very often. And he got to where in his 4th year, I think he only attended school something like 26 days, and in the 5th year, 17 or something like that, and 5th grade. And they passed him out of the 5th grade to get him out of there because they regarded as a troublemaker, and he never went back to school after that. So he doesn't have much of a formal education, but he has a pretty good mind for any of those that have read the stuff that he translates from the contact notes. And he became, because he left school early, of course, the truant officers were looking for him too. He went to work on a farm, and he drove a tractor. He did a number of things. Because of his reputation in the school, it kind of rubbed off, and he didn't have the best reputation in the town of Bulak, where he was raised and lived. And the time came when they thought that they'd lock him up because he was the troublemaker in town, and they took him to the local mental hospital. He escaped from there the first day by using simple things in his cell, and they picked him back up again, put him back in there, and put him in an isolation cell on the 2nd floor with a high window, and locked him in. And It only took him 2 days to figure out how to, with things available in the cell, to make a way to loosen the bars and get out through the window. And he let himself out the window and dropped 2 stories to the ground, injured his ankle, and made his way to the Rhone River, or the Rhine River that went past there. As soon as you heard them starting to search for him, they got dogs and they chased him to the river, and he jumped in and floated down the river to the French border, where he went ashore in trying to get help for an ankle that's now badly swollen. Somebody referred him to the French police, who suggested that he could get medical treatment at the Foreign Legion office. They recruited him into the French Foreign Legion, and he was assigned to Algeria for training. Now, that's the worst of the outposts in the French Foreign Legion, and it's a tough place to be, and all your old Foreign Legion stories are based on the Algerian outpost, but that's where he was. And he was there for a time. He made friends easily. He was a congenial fellow, but now he had better clothes than he had before, and he was eating better, and he tired of it in a few months' time and decided he was going to leave. Well, the old sergeant of his troop said, "You can't leave. Nobody ever leaves here alive." And he said, "But I'm going anyway." And the old sergeant said, "Well, if you're going, let me give you a piece of advice. Get to water as soon as you can. Nobody else makes it across the desert alone." And he took another man with him, and he ended up having to carry the other man a long ways. He got a long ways from the Legion outpost. They never did catch up to him, and he was at the point of death from lack of water when he came over a hill and he found an oasis, and they survived. He joined a caravan from there and traveled with the caravan, learning their customs, learning their religion, how they thought, how they believed, and that sort of thing. So he had a very colorful beginning, and about this time, the old man that had been training him, or about shortly before this, the old man said that he visited him for the last time, and he said, "I won't see you anymore. Another teacher will take over. Another instructor will take over." And it was some months, I think, before he heard the voice of the new instructor. It was a female voice. It turned out to be a human being, again, who called herself Asket. She said she came from what she called the doll universe, and that her mission was to help prepare him, to educate him for a future task. Now, it was Asket who led him through all of the major religions, one by one, where he lived in those societies. He learned their religion. He became a Sunday school teacher, or the equivalent of a Sunday school teacher in several of them. He worked his way across the desert with a salt caravan or a camel caravan. He got to the Red Sea. He was captured by pirates, and he was imprisoned or aboard a pirate ship for a time. They put him ashore in Turkey, and he made his way across the Middle East there to India, where he lived in an ashram for a year. So he has a very colorful background. Now, strangely, last month in New York, was almost a year ago in New York, I was at a Whole Life Expo, and I was late because my airplane was late. I had to take a taxi in to the hotel because nothing else would get me there in time, and I ran up the stairs and was running down the corridor. There's a man on the platform like this, trying to hold it until I got there. And as I ran down the corridor, a lady grabbed my arm and said, "I got to see you after this." And I said, "Okay, when I get off, I'll talk to you." And when I came out, she was waiting again, and she introduced herself. She said, "My name is Phobal Chang." And she said, "I was a 10-year-old girl in the ashram where Meier was living at the time, and I would like to tell you a little bit about what we knew of Mr. Meier there." She had a little 8-year-old brother at the time. She was the granddaughter of the head of the ashram. Her family lived there. They liked Mr. Meier because they spoke a little bit of English. Meier spoke English. He spoke some Hindi also. But they liked Mr. Meier because he had a pet monkey. And he would let the little boy play with the monkey and make him do tricks. The monkey could do some marvelous tricks. And so she remembered him very, very well. And we were sitting at a table in the Pennsylvania Hotel in New York, and she said, but the villagers around there kind of regarded him as strange. And I said, strange? What do you mean strange? What, they think he was crazy? She said, oh, no, they didn't think he was crazy. She said they thought that he was in touch with a celestial woman, or he was being visited by a celestial woman, because some of the eyes around the ashram, there's a lot of eyes in India, had seen him taking pictures of the spacecraft and had even seen him talking to the occupant of the spacecraft outside of it on the ground in India. Now, this was a corroboration I'd never heard of before. I didn't know that Meier had a monkey. I didn't know that he knew a 10-year-old girl and an 8-year-old boy there in the ashram. I didn't know who ran the place or anything else. So I wrote Mr. Meier a letter, and I asked him if he knew somebody by the name of Phobal Chang, and did he have a monkey? And he said yes. He wrote back a very nice letter. He said, yes, I had a monkey. I named him Emperor Hanuman. Hanuman is the name of the monkey king in mythology, in the Oriental mythology. And he said, yes, he did a lot of tricks. He said he could do a lot of tricks. He said, you know, I've always wondered what happened to those kids, the boy and his sister. He said, I think of them every once in a while. And how did you find them? And could you put me in touch with them? So I did. And on our way back to, the Phobal Chang now is a diplomat in the United Nations. She represents her country, Cambodia, as an international diplomat. She was going back to her country on for rebriefing additional information, and I gave her Mr. Meier's address, and she went to see him, and he welcomed her. He took her around with him for several days. When he went to the doctor, he took her along there, renewing old acquaintances. And she came back and said she had the most marvelous visit and renewing of acquaintances with the man. And she said, he is really a spiritual man. They regarded him as a spiritual man when he was in the ashram. So that was interesting, because I didn't have that information before. I didn't even know for sure that he'd been to India, except I had some photographs that were given to me by somebody else one time. That was a copy of a picture that was published on the front page of the New Delhi newspaper, and it showed 8 luminous spots in the sky over the railroad station. It was taken before a crowd of 2,000 people at the railroad station. They're waiting for a train to come in India. They get on the train, they hang on the sides, they ride on the top and everything else. And they were waiting for a train to come in, and these things gyrated all over the station there for a number of minutes, enough time for word to get to the New Delhi newspaper that there was a craft over the railroad station, unusual aircraft, and they sent a reporter to the station to do the story. He got there, people in the crowd pointed out Meier as a man with a camera that had taken the pictures, and the reporter went to Meier and asked him if he could borrow the film, and Meier gave him a roll of film. He took it back to the newspaper office, developed it, and they printed 2 pictures on the front page of the New Delhi Times, and sent the pictures and negatives to Mr. Meier after that. So I asked Meier about the pictures, and he showed me other pictures that he had taken in India, about a dozen he had. And I even published some of those in the first book I had, but I didn't have a lot of information on them. So in this letter, when I asked him about the pictures and about the monkey and about the kids, he said, I took over 300 photographs in India at that time of the spacecraft flying, maneuvering above and around the ashram and the railroad station in New Delhi City. And he said, I had all those pictures. I kept contact notes. He said I had good contact notes on those contacts. There were scores of contacts with the woman who called herself Osket from the Doll Universe. And he carefully guarded his notes, but he sent copies of important ones out to a few friends in Europe. He also sent copies of some of the pictures. When he was coming back from India, he was unemployed all this time, so he's making his living by working at whatever he can do as he goes around the country. He was a snake catcher. He was a veterinarian. He dug graves. He begged for a living. Everything you can imagine to keep body and soul together. And on his way back from the ashram now, he's carrying some baggage. He's got his contact notes, and he's got his photographs, and he's got some clothes and things that he had accumulated there. And he accepted a job with American drug enforcement people, intelligence agents pursuing a drug running ring in Turkey. And he infiltrated the ring, the Turkish ring, and was arrested with them when they were arrested coming across the border into Jordan. was thrown into jail with the rest of the ring, punished, beaten, and they took all of his things away. And when we finally got him released, they just opened the door and told him to go and don't look back. He didn't get anything back, but he carried with him. He lost his contact notes, he lost his pictures, he lost everything in Jordan. So he doesn't have a whole lot of record of what happened in India. He only has what he was able to recover from friends in Europe that he had sent out while he was there, and that's 3 or 4 of the contact notes and about a dozen or more of the pictures. So how did I get involved in all of this? I was collecting UFO photographs, been doing that for a long time, and probably a dozen years or more before this, and I had over 2,000 pictures in my file, photographs of UFOs. And I had been exchanging UFOs with UFO collectors, investigators all over the world, and I had a lot of contacts. One person that I was exchanging information with was Lou Zinstag in Switzerland. She was a multilingual journalist who published the first UFO journal in Europe in German in Basel, Switzerland. It was her area where this was all taking place, and shortly after Meier got back with the first pictures taken on the 28th of January 1975, they came to the attention of Lou Zinstag. She went to see him, and she found a poor farmer living as a guard on a property, a caretaker on a property that was not being occupied by the owners. And it was a very simple family, a man with a wife and 2 or 3 children ahead at the time. She talked to him about the case and about the pictures that he had been taken. And her first question, she was a devout fundamentalist Christian. And one of the first questions she asked him was about, did they have Jesus Christ? And he said, no, they don't have that concept there. They don't have their creation is not personified in our image. It's not like us. So this turned her off a great deal, because this flies in the face of her basic religion, and she's an older lady, and she didn't want to give that up. So she said, well, I like the man. He's a simple man, but he doesn't have Jesus Christ. The beings may not be all that good. But he gave her about 12 of the pictures at the time. And she took the 12 pictures back home, and she wrote me and told me that she had something very interesting to show me, and she thought that she ought to show them to me personally, that she was going to come to the United States in 2 weeks, and if I'd meet her at the bus station, she would bring them with her. So 2 weeks later, I met them at the bus station. They called me from New York and told me which bus they were on. And when they arrived, it was Lou Zinstag and Timothy Good traveling together. And they were on their way. They were bringing the pictures to show me of the Meier case, 12 of them. But they were also basically here to do their own investigation of the Adamski case. And they were interested in investigating what could still be investigated of the Adamski case. And they were on their way to Vista, California, to talk to any of Adamski's old neighbors and relatives that might still be around there to reinforce some information. Now, Lou Zinstag had a very personal interest in the Adamski case, because when he went to Europe on the 2 trips he made there, she was his translator. She went around with him as his translator in the Netherlands, and when he went to the Vatican in Italian, and in German around the central part there. And she was very much impressed by the Adamski figure, and she kept a lot of notes on things that they were doing. She kept a diary and made notes on Adamski and himself. And they were over here to re-verify information, from which Timothy Good later wrote a book on Adamski. And he started with Lou Zinstag's manuscript, which was the notes that she had been preparing on Adamski and her experiences with him since his visits to Europe. And he had now passed on, died of pneumonia in New York, or in Maryland. And she was going to publish her notes in the form of her own book on Mr. Adamski, which was her personal knowledge of what happened, and a lot of strange things happened while they were in Europe. So Timothy is traveling with her and was a little bit stronger figure, and he started with her notes, then he added a whole lot of notes of his own, and then he took a bunch of her notes out, so that when Timothy Goode's and Lou Zinstog's jointly written book came out, she still was dissatisfied because the story hadn't been told the way she wanted it told. So she sent me her original basic manuscript of notes on the case. The book that she wanted to write wasn't written. She still wanted to publish that book. So I took them, I put them in my file, and I had them there. I had them there for years. And when the poor lady died some years ago, I took them out and I looked at them, and I thought, there's really a lot of information here that has never come out. I'll publish them. So instead of trying to modify them or rewrite them, I took her notes, warts and all, with her handwritten corrections in there, photocopied them and reduced them to pages, and printed that book you see in there, the George Adamski, Their Man on Earth. That's Lou Zinstog's book. That's her title. I didn't change anything. The notes inside are the same. Her editing errors are there. Everything. But it's her personal idea and feeling about George Adamski. Now, this was a problem for her also because in the Meier case, when Mr. Meier took an interest in any other UFO case or any other UFO figure, the Pleiadians would tell him, don't need to pay any attention to them, it's no good, it's a hoax, or it's being faked, or something like that. And Meier was interested in Adamski because he was popular at the time, and the Pleiadians told him not once, but a number of times that Adamski was a big fraud. They told him one time that Adamski didn't take the pictures that were attributed to Adamski, that they were taken by another woman and stolen by Adamski, or that he conned her out of them. And, of course, that's not entirely true either. So we found that the Pleiadians didn't always tell the exact truth. They told Meier what they wanted him to believe, whether it was really true or not. They were guiding his thought patterns, guiding his reactions, controlling everything developing him the way they wanted him to develop. So Meier never did like Adamski. He always thought the case was a fraud. They did this to a number of other key figures that we had substantial reason to believe were legitimate and real, like the Kelvin Rowe case and several others that involved spacecraft of the design that Adamski was talking about. Now, when they got to when they looked for the intelligence agents that Adamski called his case officers. When Adamski started taking pictures, the Navy at Miramar Naval Air Station out there in California came to Adamski and asked him to watch a certain part of the sky and take whatever pictures, whatever he got, let them know about it. They knew that he was in telepathic contact with an intelligence. One of the reasons they came to him. So he took remarkable pictures, but every time Adamski had a substantial contact and reported it to the Navy case officer, finally they assigned a second one so that if he couldn't catch the first one, he could get the second one. And then the Air Force would send an executive VIP jet out to Miramar Naval Air Station from Washington to pick him up and fly him back to Washington in a military jet. And they'd keep him overnight, debrief him, whatever they wanted to ask him and tell him, and then send him back in a VIP jet again the next day. So if his case was all such a fraud, and everybody knew it, why were they doing this? But when Adamski was in Washington, I hope I'm not digressing here too much, the reason he wouldn't stay in the Pentagon. If he's going to be overnight at any time, the Pentagon always offered him a place to stay, and he wouldn't stay with the military because he's afraid they'd do something to get control of his mind, put something in his drink, hypnotize him, or something like that. And so he wouldn't stay. He'd say, no, I'm leaving, and he'd walk out of the Pentagon, go across, take the ferry across to the other side, and go to the Rotifer's house. Madeline Rotifer and her husband lived on the Maryland side across from the Pentagon, and he used to go over there because he had known them from before, and he would stay with them. And this is what Lou Zinstog and Timothy Good were running down. And when they got to Madeline Rotifer's house and asked her about the movies that were attributed to Madeline Rotifer of the spacecraft visiting Adamski, Madeline told him, well, he was here one time, and we were having breakfast on the in front of the French doors with a patio outside. And she said, we were having tea, and the doorbell rang. She went to the doorbell. They answered, there were two men out there. And she let them in. They said they were there to talk to Mr. Adamski. She let them in, and he recognized them right away as two of the aliens, his contacts. They were dressed in business suits, looked like you and I. Walked in the house, and they motioned for him to look out the window, and this thing was flying out over the garden there, and they all went outside, the two Venusians, Adamski and Madeline Rutherford. As she went out, she grabbed the camera off the shelf and was trying to film it, but she was shaking so bad, Adamski reached over and says, here, let me do that. He took it, and he filmed the pictures, the footage that you see, if you've ever seen it, and handed it back to her and said, there. So those pictures were taken by Adamski in front of two alien men standing there watching the whole thing at that time. So the Adamski case can't be written off that easily. There's a whole lot more to this, and this is what Timothy Good and Lou Zinstog were checking out and following up on when they came here on the Meier case. So the Pleiadians took great pains to make Meier think that the Adamski case was a total fraud because of all these other things that are now becoming involved in it. So when I got there the first time, Adamski, I found him. First of all, I didn't have the right address. My contact began with Lou Zinstog, but after 2 or 3 letters, she said, this is too much. I can't keep up with it all. I'm going to refer you to another friend of mine, a multilingual journalist, Ilse von Jacobi, who has written an article on Adamski, and she'll be glad to translate a few of your letters. So I sent a couple of them through Ilse von Jacobi, and she would translate them to German, send them to Meier, and Meier would write an answer in German. He'd go to Ilse von Jacobi or Lou Zinstog, and they'd translate them again into English and send them to me. And finally, this got to be an awful long process. More pictures were coming each time, and it was beginning to look like there was a lot more. They told me there were over 300 at that point. And I thought, my God, this is going to take forever. I'll just have to go over there. And about that time, I got my income tax refund back, bought tickets, and went to Switzerland to find him. When I left, I didn't have an address for him or not. My addresses were to Lou Zinstog and Ilse von Jacobi. So when we got to Germany, I went to Ilse von Jacobi's house and asked her to take me to Meier. So she said, okay, but after we got to Switzerland and Zurich, she said, I don't really know where he lives because I've never been here before, but I think we can find it. So we started out from Zurich, and if you've ever been to Switzerland, there's little tiny street signs there with points on the end that identify all the streets. We couldn't find any signs that said anything about Schmidrudi. They had moved by that time, and they were in the location they're in now. So I had another lady with me who said claimed she was psychic, and Ilse von Jacobi, of course, said she was psychic. They said, we could find him. So we're driving a rented car in Switzerland. They said, turn here. And I say, are you sure? Turn here. There's no sign that says anything about where we're going. We just turned. And we drove right up to Meier's house and parked in his driveway right in front of the place. And then Ilse says, I believe that's the house. I think that's Mrs. Meier looking out the window. And we went up. Sure enough, that was it. So that was the first indication we had that there was some other kind of outside influence involved here. We didn't know how we got there. And this is an example, though, of how these things happen. We call it synchronicity, but you'll find later that there's a whole lot more to this than that simple synchronicity. When I sat down in front of Mr. Meier, he, at his coffee table, which is a big oak door with 4 legs on the corners, and they fixed us a cup of coffee, and I sat down there on one side with Ilse von Jacobi to do my translating, and Meier on the other side, and I said, I'm sure glad to finally get here and talk to you across the table. I'm tired of these letters. And he answered, I'm pleased to meet you, Mr. Stevens, and I am glad you're here. Now, my translator said he couldn't speak a word of English, and here he's just done it. He had just answered me in English. So I looked at her, and her mouth is open, and she's looking at me, and she said, but he doesn't speak any English. I said, he just did. So then I tried to talk slowly and simply, and most of his answers were in English, and occasionally he would answer in German, and she would translate that. Now, every question I asked him, he looked me right in the eye, right straight in the eye. Never wavered. He was a simple man. I discovered soon on that he wouldn't tell a lie for any reason in the world. He claimed he was an anti-materialist. He wouldn't own anything. He didn't carry any money in his pockets. He didn't have any personal possessions but his moped, which somebody had given him, and he had a broken camera that somebody had tossed away that he had fished out of the salvage someplace and had it. That's what he was taking the pictures with. This camera had the lens, the focus adjustment on the lens. The ring was jammed. It had been dropped, and it was jammed just a little bit short of the infinity setting. And the mirror, it had a window beside the lens. It was not through the lens focusing. It was the kind that has the window on the side. And it has a mirror in it to give you the correct parallax so you could shoot a decent picture with it. The drop had broken the mirror loose. You couldn't even look through it anymore. So he shot his pictures by holding his camera out this way because he couldn't look through it anyway. And with a focus adjustment he couldn't control, and he used one light setting. He used f11. He shot everything at f11 and 125th of a second on ASA 100 film. All those beautiful pictures were shot that way. That's how good a photographer he was. He really didn't know anything about photography at the time, and he didn't care. His camera worked, and he could use it. Now, after he had taken the first few sets of pictures, friends tried to give him better cameras. And he took the better cameras with him and tried to use them, but he couldn't work them with one hand. The little one that he had rescued from the salvage was a small Japanese Ricoh-type camera that he could do everything. He could hold the camera in one hand, roll the film, snap the pictures, and everything else, and he always went back to that. He just couldn't use the bigger cameras. So here I find a man who is taking beautiful pictures of UFOs. He got one arm. He lost one in an accident, and he can only do this with one arm. He's taking these marvelous pictures with good scenery that look like somebody posed the ships and everything else. And the composition was even good. They were marvelous pictures. And he didn't know anything about photography. He's using a broken camera. And I'm thinking, he's getting some help someplace. But I took the pictures. I brought them home from that trip, and I started looking for somebody to do some analysis on them. I knew that Ground Saucer Watch was testing pictures and claimed they had a way to do this. So I went to Ground Saucer Watch first. They didn't have time to mess with me. They looked at them and said, yeah, they're fakes. And I thought, well, they don't know enough about them, or they wouldn't be saying that. So we started looking for somebody with an open mind. And we were looking for, we had other evidence too at the time. I had a piece of metal, I had a number of things, and we were looking for a scientist who had an open mind, probably a cross-disciplinary scientist that wasn't locked into peer pressure in any particular field. And we found this in the case of Mr. Jim Dilatoso. Didn't even have a degree. But Jim Dilatoso had gone to school until he was 28 years old. He had gone to college long enough to have gotten a half a dozen degrees if he had decided to specialize in anything and wrote the papers. But he liked going to school. He was what we call a professional student. He liked going to school. His family could afford it. He just kept going to college, taking more subjects. He'd taken all the electives, and I was taking all the sciences. And so when we started talking to Dilatoso and trying to figure out how are we going to get a hold of this, how are we going to analyze this material, he said, well, let's start with the experts. So he went to Ground Saucer Watch and talked to them, asked them how they were doing this. We found that they were bootlegging their time on a computer, an old computer with a minimum 5-micron window, which is big for a computer. And the computer was one that was used to analyze flaws in castings for jet engines. And they were doing it at night on that computer, and they were using 4 steps that didn't show them anything. So Dilatoso immediately recognized that this is not scientific. They're eyeballing it and making the computer say what they want it to say, and then writing up a little story describing what was going on and getting away with it. So we talked to Bill Spaulding's second-hand man, asked him if we could get a look at the equipment. So we did, and we found out that it was manufactured by Spatial Data Systems at Goleta, California. So we went out to Spatial Data Systems to find out what they knew about the system, and they said, "Oh yeah, this system." They came out here and looked at it. They said a man came in here and looked over our equipment and gave us this 4-point program for analysis. He gave us a name, a very famous name today in UFO research. But they said that what we really needed to do was find out a way to do what we wanted to do, that the procedure that was being used wasn't the best. We said, well, can you demonstrate it? So they went to their showroom where they had a new model of the same equipment that was being used by Air Research in Phoenix, and they took the shade off from a lamp on a table, turned the 100-watt bulb over the picture we laid on the table, picked up a Panasonic home video, about a $1,200 job, and holding it by hand like this, shot the picture to get it into memory, and then transferred that to the computer, and then that's what they analyzed. Well, right away they lost everything because they didn't have a stable mount. They were holding it by hand. They had incandescent light, 100 watts, and it was reflected from a thing on a table. There was no light table. There was no filters. The resolution on the camera itself was so bad it couldn't have shown anything anyway. So we thought, gee whiz, what are we up against here? This is no way to test anything. We've got to find a better way. So the people at Goleta said, go over to JPL. They're the ones that are making these beautiful pictures from this fuzzy image data that's coming back from the satellites, and maybe they can tell you how to do it. So we did. We went over to JPL, and we introduced ourselves at the front office, and we were ushered back into the office of Frank Bristow, who was the administrative supervisor of the JPL visitor's office at the time. And, of course, we had to sign in on the sign-in book and everything else to do this. To get in there at all, you have to do that. So we showed him the pictures, and he scratched his head and multiple. We wanted to talk to their image sciences people, the ones that were making good pictures out of the bad ones coming back from space. And he scratched his head, and he said, well, he said, first of all, I want you to go out and sign out on the book, and then come back to the office here. So we did, and then we went back into his office, and he pulled out his middle drawer in the desk, and he gave us internal badges. He says, use these, and when you go, give them back to me. Don't sign in or out anymore. Don't carry your cameras. No tape recorders, and I'll take you down to the Imaging Sciences Division. He took us down to see Bob Nathan, who later denied that we'd ever been there. But we were ushered into Bob Nathan's office, and we showed him the pictures, and he looked at them, and he said, oh, they look too good to be true. He said, they're probably fakes. He said, well, can you tell us how we can fake these? He thought a little bit, and he said, well, I don't know. Anything I think of just doesn't quite fit. He said, well, we can take a look at them. So then we're talking about UFO pictures now, and he says, these may be fakes, but he says, he pulled open his left drawer over here in his desk, top of his desk, and pulled out 4 pictures, and he says, these are real. I can tell you these are real because I've tested them exhaustively. Now, the pictures that he pulled out and handed us were the pictures, the Heflin pictures, photographed at Santa Ana, California, that disappeared 5 years before that, and everybody thought the Navy stole them. Here he's got them in his upper left-hand drawer in his desk, and they were the original Polaroids taken with the county camera. And he's tested them. He says, these are real. He put them back in his desk. So he said, come on with me, and we'll go down to Bob Post downstairs and have him make copies of the pictures. We had 4 pictures. Now, before we started testing, we decided that we would do the best we could, but we couldn't test them all. So we would pick the best picture in a series, in a sequence of 4 different sequences, 4 different pictures, from 4 different sequences, and the best of the lot for testing, the one that had the most image data in it. And that's what we were carrying with us to Bob Post's laboratory. And that's what we went downstairs and rephotographed, and he made negatives and positives and everything else and gave them back to us. And they ran their own testing, and they said, we can't give anything out of here. We're not in that business, but we'll tell you how we're doing it, and you can go to the manufacturer of the same equipment array. They were using Dianza equipment at JPL at the time, and we copied the model numbers off from everything that they used, and went to the Dianza factory where we set up another line and duplicated what they did the way they told us they were doing it to get the first image data report we had on the pictures, which turned out to be a pretty good one. When we found Jim Delatoso, going to back up a little bit here, he was working on a color synthesizer for, I think it was Motorola Systems, had commissioned him to find the color equivalent of sounds and try to create a device that would project colors in the same vibrational frequency but higher in the octave as the sounds. For instance, sound vibrates at a certain frequency, an octave or two above, the same color may be red. And he was working on that when we found him. Later they patented the thing. But we picked him because he was a multidisciplinarian. He didn't have a degree. He wasn't stuck in anything. But wherever we went with him, wherever we took him, he spoke the jargon. And we discovered this immediately when we went to the computer manufacturers. They thought he was a computer manufacturer. And actually he was, in a sense, because his father was making computers at the time. But when we went to the laser people then, he spoke the laserology lingo. And they thought he was a laser expert because he spoke their language. Every discipline we went into has a characteristic lingo and a certain kind of language that those specialists in that field use. So everybody thought that he had a doctorate in whatever we were talking about. When we got to optical sciences, the same thing. And so we found that we could make friends in every discipline easily because of Jim's familiarity with everything. But because he's familiar with everything, he also knew more than most of the people who were disciplined only in that subject. And that's why they thought, gee, this guy knows more than we do. That's why we used him, and that's why we got in a lot of doors that we would not have gotten into. So later people come along and say, well, he doesn't even have a doctorate. Well, he didn't need a doctorate. He later wrote a paper, he did it in a week, and sent it in and got a doctorate. You know? So he didn't need it. But to come back to what we were doing now, we're doing our testing here. We're being challenged by everybody on the nature of our testing. And about this time, we were invited to go to the SPIES conference in San Diego. The SPIES conference is an imaging sciences conference where they draw in the latest state-of-the-art manufacturers, engineers, designers, programmers, and everything from all the big manufacturers all over the world into a conference in San Diego. And they do it once a year. And when we got to the De Anza Systems factory to try to use their equipment, they were getting ready to go to the SPIES conference, and they says, why don't you come with us down here? You can come as our guests, and we'll see what other people have to think about how we're doing this, and maybe we can get some good recommendations. So we went down there, and after they closed the exhibits every day, which was about 10 o'clock at night, we would get people that we had picked out that were manufacturing cutting-edge technologies. And we'd push them together in a big display room there and hook up new arrays, different arrays, and try different testing. We learned a whole lot of things out there. We learned that you can take a flat two-dimensional picture, for instance, and that in just a flat picture, black and white or color, you can find out how many objects are moving in the picture, which direction they're moving, about how fast relative speed they're going. And this all had to do with things that we were learning as we proceeded. So we came back from there and set up a testing program in Phoenix using special selected arrays from this and began testing our own pictures, and that's where we got the test data that we published. Now, that was way back in 1979, so we've done it again in anticipation of what was going to be a pro and con discussion here. We convened another conference like the SPIES conference in Phoenix just a month ago and brought in optical sciences experts from all over the world by the Wrigley people. And they were interested in the optical sciences. And from that group, we posed the problem. How do we test these things today? How could we get a better way to do it? And they studied it for a few days, and we invited some of the selected experts into another meeting in Dilatos's office, and they said, well, your technique was pretty good before, but here's what we can do now. And so we had prepared to bring one of the experts from that meeting out here. He was impartial. He didn't believe in UFOs and didn't care whether they were real or not. And we were going to have him critique the methods used by the people that say that they have found a positive proof that these pictures are all fake. And they didn't come, so he didn't come. Now, back to the Swiss case. There were things that developed in this case as we were going that were unbelievable. First of all, when I got there the first time, Mr. Meier took me around to a number of the photographic sites, and we walked over them, and I could see right away that this is going to be difficult to suspend models in. You can't throw them in. You can't shoot them in. You can't. The terrain would slope down steeply like that for 1,000 feet. And the pictures were taken of the object out over the valley. The other side of the valley comes up 5 miles away. So there's no way they could be suspended. And I called Lee and Tom, who had from Intercept. They were friends of mine in Phoenix with a little intelligence business, and they were performing debugging, electronic debugging of telephone systems and bank computer systems. And they were doing a job in London for some London banks, and they were there at the time. And I called him and said, "You got to come over here and see what I'm seeing. This guy couldn't have faked these." And up to this point, I thought there may have been a way to do it. And I said, "There's no way that can be done." So they came over the next day, and we walked over the sites again, drove over them. And looking at them once more, they said, "Well, this is going to take some sophisticated equipment, but we can work it out. We'll rent laser surveying instruments so we can measure distances across valleys, and we'll take pictures. We'll try to duplicate it. We'll make models and suspend them into the scene and all these things." And we went to a number of sites, and they came away. They said, "We don't do this business, but this is interesting because if he's faking it, he's got a new technique, and we're going to find out about it." Now, these men were licensed private investigators in the state of Arizona. They also had international licenses, which they were using in London, already had business in Zurich. And so we did. We rented laser surveying instruments to shoot distances across valleys. We could measure distance, we could measure levels, we could measure elevation, we could measure a lot of things. And we brought the data back to Jim De La Tosa, and using the geometry of the lens and the distances that we measured, we could calculate the approximate size of the craft very easily. From the photographs, with other techniques, we could tell whether they were moving or not, which direction they were moving. So now we were building a database that was very interesting and becoming quite exciting. We had metal specimens that we took out to a private laboratory. The head of the IBM research, the designer of the inventor of the floppy disk and magnetic tape, Dr. Marcel Vogel. Well, he wasn't even a doctor. He was like Jim De La Tosa. He was a genius, but he invented the floppy disk and the tape for IBM. And he had a laboratory in his house, and he agreed to test our metal specimens for us because he was a metallurgist to begin with. And he's the one that did the testing that came later that showed that this was probably a material. You going to leave, Michael? Oh, okay. Probably a metal specimen that couldn't be duplicated any way that they know how. So now I've had them over there, and this is my second trip. And we came back from there, and they agreed, although this was not the business of Intercept, and they shouldn't get involved in anything as kooky as this, if we could keep it low level, that they would help me conduct the investigation. By this time, I had been back once to AFRO, and I now knew that the investigation isn't anything anybody's going to conduct in a short time. You can't do it in a few days, and you can't do it in a parlor like was the normal procedure for UFO groups. They'd go to a case, interview the man in his house over the coffee table, make some notes, and go back and file a report. This was going to take some in-depth work, and it's going to take staying time. It's going to take weeks, maybe months, and several trips and a lot of money. So I was trying to get support for this. I realized there's no UFO club in the country that can afford to conduct the kind of investigation that would be necessary to find out what's really going on with this case and with these beautiful pictures. And once they agreed to do this over the telephone, things began to change. We began to be followed every place we went. Our telephones were tapped. And at first, this was very disturbing because they didn't know why it was being done. Why would, if our government denies the existence of UFOs, why are they tapping our phones and following us around? I was followed so often, I knew which cars were the cars that were doing the following. I could recognize them, and they would stay. They'd keep at least one car between me and them all over town and wherever we went, any place. So when we were going to have a meeting to discuss something, Lee would call me at home, and he'd say, "Go to a public telephone and call me back at such and such a number in 5 minutes. If you don't make it in 5 minutes, go back home, wait for another call." I'd go do that call him from the grocery store or in front of the Circle K or whatever I could, and he'd say, "Meet me at the usual place." By the time I got halfway across town, my green Cadillac, or Lincoln, it was a green Lincoln sedan, would be behind me. It was driven by a man who once ran for county attorney in the city of Tucson. He was always there. He's an elderly man, wore a nice business suit, gray hair, but I couldn't shake the guy. And they had relays too. They could pass off. So I'm telling Lee, why are they doing this? If there's nothing to this, why is this going on? And so we used to meet at Picacho. It's a landmark between Tucson and Phoenix where we could go up the side of a hill and see everything below us coming from every direction. And we found that later they had even bugged the site where we're meeting. We gave too much away. So now a time came when we're going back for the second trip, and we've talked about it a couple of times on the phone, and then we went to these strange secrecy techniques like kids, trying to get away with something, and we decided that they decided they would join me in the investigation, which now is going to be a deviation from their pattern. And a few days after that, about 10 days after that, Lee got a letter in the mail from the Knights, with the return address on the corner said the Knights Templars of Malta, and it came from London. It was an airmail letter. And inside, on engraved parchment, was a typed letter that said, "We believe we have interests in common. Please, and that you may be coming to Europe in the near future. Please contact us by telephone." Well, we decided we wouldn't contact them by telephone. We didn't need any help. And what were they talking about? We hadn't a good idea what they were talking about, but we were not going to tell anybody. We're trying to keep the whole thing secret. So we didn't respond. And 2 weeks later, we got another letter in the mail. This time it came on House of Lords stationery, engraved stationery again. Now, the first letter from the Knights Templars of Malta was signed, after the brief little 2-paragraph message, was signed Mark Nathan, Secretary General of the Knights Templars of Malta. So now we reject that. We don't do anything about it. The next one that came on House of Lords stationery, and it's a letter inside the same way. And this one was another invitation says, "You didn't respond to our last letter. We still are interested in a communication. Please contact us as soon as you get to London." Now, we hadn't told anybody we were going to London. I hadn't even told my daughters I was going to London. So we decided to ignore that one too. Now, this letter on the House of Lords stationery was signed again, Mark Nathan, Secretary before the Rod, or something like that it was. It's a strange secretary title that's used in the House of Commons in London. And now he's got our curiosity because it's the same name and the same signature on two different important letterheads. So we decided we would wait until we got out of Switzerland and call him on the way back. We didn't want anybody to know where we were or what we were doing. And these guys, because they were private investigators, always insisted on the greatest secrecy. I mean, they went to great pains to obscure everything that we were doing. And so we bought the cheapest tickets possible on Laker Airlines, it was at the time, and went to London in tourist class, steerage class in the back, and got off at the London airport and caught the subway. Now, how can anybody follow you on the subway? We caught the subway into town and got off at Victoria Station. Now, the subway runs every 10 minutes. So if anybody's going to be able to pick something out, this is going to be tough. We got off the subway at Victoria Station and are going to the street to take a taxi cab to an old gunnery sergeant's house where we were going to stay. A friend that we had met before who had a walk-up. He was renting rooms in his walk-up. We weren't even staying in a hotel. And we came out of down the railroad platform heading for the taxi exit, and a big, tall, black cabbie, London cabbie, comes up to us, tapped Lee on the shoulder and says, "You're Mr. Elders?" Lee said, "Yes." He said, "Come with me." We said, we're going to take a taxi. We're tired. We want to go get some sleep. We have reservations. He said, "I have your reservations." So we thought, well, maybe the old gunner sergeant has sent him down there. So we got in his cab, put our bags in there, and he didn't drive us the direction we were going. We wanted to go out of London, and he took us right downtown London, around Hyde Park, and parked in front of the Grosvenor House. The Grosvenor House is a big apartment hotel on Hyde Park, right on the side of the Hyde Park. that looks at the American embassy on one side and the Russian embassy on the other. And he parked in front, said, I'll lock the bags in the car, come with me, and he locked everything in there. We went in the lobby. He motioned to somebody, and another man came along. We got on an elevator, took us up to the third floor, and he's not giving us any opportunity to refuse or anything else. Now, there were some bars that could be drawn across at that time. I thought they were fire protection, but they may have been something else. Anyway, we got through, and we got off the elevator on the fifth floor, walked down to room number, I think it was 520 on the left-hand side. He knocked on the door, opened it. There was a man with spectacles and business suit behind the door. He said something to him. They motioned us in. It was a kind of a wet bar. There was a refrigerator. There was a little hot plate on one side. There was a sink, things like that, and another door on the other side of this little entryway. He went to that and opened it up and ushered us into a big sitting room. Big sitting room. It was about, for London, it was immense. It was about 20 feet one direction by 10 or 12 the other direction. And in that room was a large overstuffed sofa, four seats, four-cushion one, a big one, and a big, heavy coffee table. And then on the other side, to the left of it, was a shorter love seat type, two-cushion sofa. And over in the corner over here was a big black overstuffed chair with the big black fat arms on a little table on each side, on each arm. And on that side, facing the big lounge, the big sofa, were the picture windows, full wall of picture windows that looked out on Hyde Park. And we were introduced to Mark Nathan. And he's standing in front of this big, fat, black, overstuffed chair, and he smiles and he motions us to sit down, you know. So I sat down on the big sofa. Lee and Britt were near the small one. They sat down on the two-cushion sofa. And he sat down, and I started to pull my pants up over my knees like that so it wouldn't be uncomfortable. And about that time, the white telephone on his right-hand side rang 10 short rings. Now, immediately, we knew what that was because we had been in Meier's house at a time when the Pleiadians would ring his telephone 10 short rings to let him know that what he was thinking was them and not his own thoughts. Early on, he wasn't clearly able to distinguish between telepathic transmissions and his own thoughts. And then, in that case, they would signal him 10 short rings on his telephone. Now, no telephone in the world can ring 10 short rings because there's only 6 lobes on the cam. You can get any combination of 6, you can't get 10. And we took his telephone apart to be sure of this. And he had the same kind of a phone. It's a bunch of rotary cams, and it can't be rung short. You can't get 10 rings of any kind. So here, we'd heard this in Meier's house. So here we're sitting in front of this Mark Nathan, who we don't know who he is at the time. And his phone rings 10 short rings, and he said, he tried to answer it, and there was nobody on the line. And he said, hello, hello, and he tried, and he said, well, that's strange, he said. And I looked at Lee, and Lee and Britt looked at me, and we know what it is. We say, have you ever heard a ring like that before? He said, that was kind of strange, wasn't it? Lee said, do you think it rung 10 times? And he said, well, maybe. And he said, I'll find out. And he picked up his phone, and he called down to the desk. He said, who rang? They said, no calls to your room. He said, could anybody call this room from any place else in the hotel? And they said, not going through the switchboard. There's been no calls to your room. And there were some more questions, and he put it down and shook his head and started to talk, and the red phone on the other side rang 10 short rings. So he says, I'll find out about this. And he picked it up and said, hello. There's nobody on there. And he says, this is a secure phone. It's monitored 24 hours a day. Nobody can dial in here that doesn't have a certain security clearance. He says, I'll find out about this. And he asked that operator and said, no, you haven't had any calls. No lights on the board. Nobody's called you. And he put it back up. And then he introduced himself, and he said his name was Mark Nathan, that he was the case officer for the London District. That's CIA case officer for the London District. That means he's in charge of the whole London District, and we're sitting in his office, and he's Mark Nathan, and he signed these 2 fake documents, the letter from the Knights Templars of Malta and the letter from the House of Commons in London. And then he proceeds to tell us that they're interested in what we're doing, that they haven't been able to get a man inside, and they wondered if we would talk to him on the way out. So we said, sure, we'll talk to you. And he wished us well and sent us on our way. They told us what they knew about the case, and we probably talked to him no more than 10 minutes, and he sent us downstairs. He sent us to our residence in a big limousine, which probably surprised all the neighbors because the gunnery sergeant lived in a very poor neighborhood of London. And then, after that, every time we went in and out, we were picked up by the CIA, taken to his office, and we were either asked what we were going to do going in, or we were asked what we did when we came out. And if we were carrying pictures or anything, they asked to see them, and when we handed them to them, they'd take them out, and they'd bring them back 15 or 20 minutes later. We'd talk about various things, and we finally had been to his office so many times we were getting to be on a first-name basis. We called him Mark, and he called us by first names. About the fourth time we came out, he said, look, he said, my wife would like to fix you dinner tonight. Can you come by for dinner? So we said, sure. He said, I'll send the limo to pick you up. We're staying at the gunnery sergeant's place again. He said, I'll send the limo to pick you up about 5 o'clock. That'll be okay? And we said, sure, that's fine with us. So the limo arrived, and we got in it, and we went to his house, and he introduced us to his wife. His wife was an ethnic Chinese lady who was a Chinese intelligence agent. Sun Chi Li, are you here? She was a Chinese intelligence agent before Mark Nathan met her. Mark Nathan was an American intelligence agent, and we came to the conclusion that it was a marriage of convenience. It gave us a channel into their operations and gave them a channel into ours. Why this had to be the Chinese, I don't know. But she was very gracious. She fixed a wonderful Chinese dinner. We had a nice dinner that was very sociable. We talked about ordinary things. And afterwards, they invited us into their living room to have tea. And we sat down on the sofa and the chairs there, and things were proceeding very friendly when Mark Nathan got up and he said, you know, I got something you'll be interested in. And he went to the table at the end of the sofa I was sitting on. It was a round end table with a lamp on it and some flowers. And he went to the end of the table at the end. He took the flowers off, set it on the floor, took the lamp off and set it on the floor, and picked up the table, and it was a shell. And under the shell was a safe. He knelt down. He says, "Don't look at me while I turn." Of course, he had his back between us and the numbers. And he twirled the dial, and he opened the safe, swung the door open, and he says, "Come here." And we went over there, and he first took out a package of passports and laid them on the floor. There's about 8 or 9 passports tied together with a rubber band. And Lee says, "Are all those yours?" He said, "Yeah, I travel a lot." So Lee says, "Well, what countries are they?" And he handed them to him. Lee took the rubber band off. There was India. He had a passport from India with his picture and signature. Passport from Canada with his picture and signature. Passport from a Scandinavian country, an American passport, a diplomatic passport, a security passport from, he had 8 of them, and his name and signature in them all. And Lee says, "Well, you must do a lot of traveling." He said, "I really need them once in a while." And but he was setting things out, and he got down to a paper bag, a grocery bag, about that size. And he took it out, and he said, "This is what I'm looking for." And in the course of getting to the bag, he moved 8.5 by 11 mimeograph booklet that was about 3/4 of an inch thick, had a blue cover, had a red stripe down from the upper right-hand corner to the lower left-hand corner. He took it out and laid it on the floor, and then he put some other things on it, and he handed the bag to Lee, and what was in the bag was miniature pickups. There were pickups in there so small that you could take the eraser out of a lead pencil, put the pickup onto the eraser, push it back in place. There was a little wire that stuck up along the side. He said, "This can transmit as much as 500 feet. But he had things that you could put them in a lot of other things, too. And Lee said, "Boy, that is remarkable. Technology says this is the latest state of the art." So then he showed us a couple other things he showed that he had in there. And then he started putting everything back in, and he put the blue book with the red tape on it in there, and he put the passports on the top and closed the door and twirled the dial and put the shell back over again and plants back on and the lamp. And we went on talking. And he drove us home in his limousine that night. We walked up our walk up 4 floors to the bedroom, and it was near midnight, and we were tired. And I walked in Lee's room with him and Britton, and he started undressing. He took his keys out of his pocket and laid them up on a wardrobe, a standalone wardrobe like that that you put clothes in. And he dumped all the change in his pocket up there, and he laid some other things down. He started taking his shoes off, and I said, "Well, I think I'll go to bed." And Britt said, well, we'll see you in the morning. And I heard him lock the door behind me. I went across the hall to my own room. It was right across from their door. The next morning, I get up early. The next morning, I was up about 5 o'clock. And I thought, before I left, I said, hey, I'm going to go down for early breakfast. You know, if we wait too long, there's not much left. So if you want me to wake you up, fine. And Lee said, yeah, get me up. We'll go for a walk. So I get up about 5 o'clock, and I went across the hall and knocked on the door, and I heard a sleepy voice, and he come and unlocked it, and the hair's all over his head, and he's standing there in his shorts. And he said, oh, come on in. I'll get ready, get dressed. So we went in, and I sat down in a little chair beside the sink there, and he went over and got his shirt and put it on, pulled his pants on, and then reached over to get his change and his keys off the wardrobe, and they're not on the metal that he laid them on the night before. They're on top of a 8.5 by 11 blue book, about 3/4 of an inch thick, with a blue cover and a red tape running from the upper right hand to the lower left hand corner across it. And he looks at it and he says, Jesus Christ, you ever seen this before? And I said, yeah. It was in that safe we looked at last night. He said, yeah. He says, what did it say? We looked at the cover, same thing. He says, oh, we got to call Mark and let him know what happened. Now, we woke Britt up and says, how did this get here? And she says, I don't know. I didn't bring anything back last night. Do you bring anything back? No, we didn't bring anything back. And we're puzzling about this. He said, well, we got to let him know. So we went down to the phone at the landing in the stairs in the hallway, called Mark Nathan, got him out of bed, told him, we've got your blue book. He said, oh, no, you haven't. He said, it's in the safe. But he said, well, you better look and see if it's still there, because we got one just like it in the room. So he said, just a minute, I'll take a look. And he came back about less than 5 minutes later, all out of breath, and he says, where did you get it? You haven't looked at it, have you? We said, no, we haven't looked at it. We're not concerned about it. He said, don't look, I promise you, you won't look at it. I'll be right there. And he whistled up in about 12 minutes in his limousine, ran all the way up the stairs, came to the door out of breath, and he says, where is it? And we said, we haven't touched it. It's right there on the right where we found it this morning. He picked it up and looked at it. He said, Jesus Christ. He says, how did you get it out of the safe? We thought, we don't know. And that was an example of what I call interference that was perpetrated by somebody. That was one example. There were lots of examples. This is what makes this case so credible. You don't have to ask me whether I believe it or not. I try not to assert that it's real, because there's a lot of things I don't like to assert. But there are things like this all through the case that make it highly credible to me. The ringing of the telephone, the things coming out of locked safes. We were coming out of there one time with some pictures, 300 pictures that I had bought from Mr. He always insisted on giving them to me, and I didn't want them free, and I'd pay him for the cost of reproducing them. And we're coming out with those, and when we got to the railroad station and got on the train, now we didn't have tickets or passports or anything. I mean, we had passports. We didn't have advanced reservations or anything. We got on a train and rode to the French border, and when you change trains in Switzerland when you go into France, by the time we got to the French border and changed trains and got on a car, there was nobody else on the car. There was a French officer sitting on one end, a police officer, and we got on the car, and we thought he was just monitoring traffic coming in. When the train pulled out, nobody else got on the car. We walked down to the other end. There's another police officer sitting on the other end of the car. And we asked him if there's anything about the car, and he, and we rode all the way across France, just 3 people in that whole darn train car with a French officer on each end all the way to the port where we got off to go take the boat train across. Why that was, I'll never know. I've never been on a European train with nobody else on the car but me. And the only thing that was different is we had 300 pictures with us. And the officers never said anything. I don't think they even knew why they were there. And maybe they weren't there for that reason, but it was really peculiar. Another time when we were carrying pictures, we got off in a crowd of people, and you know, Michael, when you get off and you get in a crowd, you get in a long line to go through customs, right? So we got a lot of that, always carried a lot of stuff. So it takes us longer to get there, and the whole line is ahead of us. And we're way back down the line and thinking we'll never get a seat on the ferry boat because we're too far back. All the seats will be gone. Well, we're standing there talking. Lee gets tapped on the shoulder. It's a French customs officer. Tapped him on the shoulder and says, motion for us to come with him. And we went past all the people in the line. He opened another station to the left that was unmanned. Motioned for us through, checked the passport, stamped them, motioned us on. We got through, and he closed the station and left. Now, why that happened, I'll never know. when we got down on the starting platform, we were supposed to catch a certain train and car, we thought, and we asked there's a policeman there, and where it was should have been on this track, and just on that track over there, number 14. So we said, but it's over here. No, on that track over there. But there's our train over there. So we followed him and we went over there, and the train pulled out. And we got to our destination okay, but we were on a different train entirely. Well, that time we had some intelligence agents following us that somebody didn't want following us, and they got on the right train, and we're on the wrong train. And the intelligence agents that thought they were on a car we were on got into a fight on a railroad platform in Amsterdam, were arrested and thrown in jail. And when we got to London and we're taking to Mark Nathan's office, he says, "What the hell do you do? Who ever taught you to sanitize a trail like that?" We said, "What do you mean sanitize a trail?" He says, how do you give my men the slip? They're the best in the business." We said, "We didn't know we gave anybody the slip." He said, "2 men over in jail over there. He had to send 2 more men to get them out, take more passports and get them out." Now, why that kind of interference? I mean, why is that happening over a case that is ridiculous? It's a UFO case. The government says they don't exist. And somebody's spending an awful lot of money. They're spending as much money to follow us as we're spending to get there. And this just went on and on all the way through the case. How long have we been going here? Oh, my God. You want a break? You want to stand up and stretch a minute? Okay, let's take about a 5-minute break and just stretch. If you have to go to the bathroom, do so. Jesus Christ, we're running out. Come up here.
Can you tell them the story about when...
And I was at the house, and Meier had been ill all day. He had the flu, and he hadn't eaten any breakfast, he hadn't eaten any lunch, and it was late in the afternoon, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and he was pretty weak, had been laying on the sofa all day. And I was standing in front of the television set watching a news program when I heard him make a little noise, and I looked around and he motioned for me to come over to him. So I went over there. There was a glass of water on the table. He was too weak to even pick the glass of water up at the time. And I bent down to see what he wanted, and he whispered, "Get Elsie." So I went to get Elsie, and she listened to him, and she went and got his wife, and between the two of them, they got him up off the sofa, walked in between them into the bedroom and disappeared. And then they came out. One was carrying boots and a boot shining kit, and another one brought a shirt out and set up an ironing board and started ironing the shirt. And I said, "What's going on?" And Elsie said, "Well, he's been summoned for a contact." I said, "In that condition? How can he go to a contact?" She said, "He'll make it." So he came out after having taken a bath, and he before a contact, he takes a bath, and he changes all of his clothes from the inside out. Underclothes, outer clothes. His shoes are shined. They clean up everything. He brushes his hair, combs out his beard, like he's going to a big business meeting. And he came out about an hour later and into the kitchen, where I'm out there with the women drinking coffee and watching what's happening. And they brought out his pistol and his walkie-talkie. His pistol, mind you, is a 44, an old Western 44. It's the heaviest gun in the world. It's got a bore on it like that, and it weighs a lot. I can hardly lift the thing. And that's what he carries for protection. He carries it in a big holster on the side. And he took that out, and he sat down at the table, dumped all the bullets out, and looked in the barrel, put the bullets back in again, put it together, put it in his holster. And then he took the walkie-talkie, opened it up, and dumped the batteries out, and put fresh batteries in. Then he put his wife came out with an Air Force B-4 jacket, a blue jacket with a mouton collar, fake fur collar, because it had been raining all day. It had been raining the day before, all night, all this day, and it was still drizzling, lightly raining. There's little raindrops bouncing into puddles that were all over the place because it had been raining so long. So they put this coat on him to protect him from that. He didn't wear anything on his head, and he's standing in front of the stove, which is at one end of this big oak table in the kitchen. I was at the other end at the sink pouring me a cup of coffee. People started coming in the door from work. It's about 6 o'clock now. Well, it was later than that. It was about 8 o'clock. And they were coming in the door from work, and they see him already. They know where he's going. They just look at him and ask a couple of questions and go on about their way. A few stood there waiting to see when he was going to leave, but he's all prepared, but he hasn't got the final signal of where he's going and when. And finally, I'm just pouring a cup of coffee when he raised his little hand and kind of a wave to them, a salute, and started out the door. He finally got the word. So I set my coffee cup down, and I raced around the table and out the side door. I want to see him go. I missed everything else. I'm going to see it this time. And as I passed the stove, the clock was right over the stove. It said 8:25. I remember that. And when I got to the door, the big dog that was chained on a chain could run right out just close enough to scare the hell out of you, but he couldn't bite you because he was restrained. And I jerked the door open. The dog just missed me, and I went out the door and into a lean-to. It was a lean-to like this that ran about 15 feet to a door that went outside. And I got out into the lean-to to see the door in the end of it closing on his heels. And I ran to the door and jerked it open like that because I'm not going to let him out of my sight. And when I jerked it open, there's 1, 2, 3 footsteps in the mud out there. The ground was soft enough, the mud squished out of the footprints like that. And water was bouncing in the little drops were bouncing in the puddles all around. Water was starting to run in the first footprint. And there was no fourth footprint. And it was quiet. It was silent. There was no noise out there. There was no light, no beacons, no sound of any kind, and he's gone. And I thought, he couldn't have. How could he could he back up? No, he'd back into me. Did he run around the house? Couldn't run around the house. I even ran around the house to see if he could have, and all I left was slippery, muddy prints out there. And I got all wet waiting for him to come back. And I missed him going, so I want to see when he returns. And I got all wet. I went in, changed clothes, and I put on a raincoat, and I went back out. Was standing outside when there was a telephone call ring in the house, and somebody answered it upstairs and then raised the window and said, it's Billy. He's down. He's over at Elg, and he wants you to come with his wife and Jacobus to pick him up. So we got in the car and splashed through puddles. The rain was pouring down in some places and just drizzling in others. There was a lot of mud and slipping around on those mountain roads. We went all the way around the mountain, about 18 miles, to Elg to pick him up. And when we got there, we found him standing under that little eave. It's only about 3 boards wide, over 3 steps that goes into the side of a guest house. And he's standing under the eave, and he doesn't have any mud on his shoes. He's not wet. His hair's not wet. Dry as could be, and he's been out in the storm for some 45 minutes. It was, when the call came in, it was about 20 after 9, and he went out at 8:25. So he got in the car, and he's obviously dry, and I said, can you tell us anything about what happened? He said, oh, I don't want to talk about it, Mr. Stevens. Now I have to back up a minute because I forgot one thing. When I came in, when I was all wet, came in the house and changed clothes, and I came downstairs, the Germans were all bunched up in front of the television set there watching something on the screen. So I went in to take a look. And on the screen was black with white letters on it. It just a big cross, and it said in German, the Pope has passed. The Pope has died. And I said, how did he die? And they said, haven't made any announcement yet, just the music and the sign. The program stopped, the sign, the music, that's all. No announcement. So I thought, well, hell, I don't need to watch this. I want to go out and see the big thing. I want to see him come back. So I went outside to wait, and then they got the call, and he came back, and then now we get in the car, and I said, I'm trying to make conversation, and he's facing the front, and his wife is sitting next to me in the back, and I said, did you hear the news? He said, you mean about the Pope? And I said, yeah. They haven't even announced how he died yet. We don't know what happened. He said his pump failed. His heart failed. I said, well, how'd you know that? He said, I watched him. And I thought, oh, that's just really strange. And I asked him some more questions. He said, I don't want to talk about it. But when we got to the house, the Germans all went in the living room and closed the door. And they stayed in there talking and talking and talking. Nobody came out, so I finally got tired and went to bed. And I'm up early the next morning to see what happened the night before. And he got up about 10 o'clock, and I waited from 6 o'clock till 10 o'clock for him to get up. And I tried to ask him questions in the kitchen, and he motioned for me to come out on the patio. And we went out there, and he said, sit down, Mr. Stevens. I did. He said, I watched them murder a pope last night. And I said, murder a pope? They don't murder popes. He said, they do. They've done it before, and they did this one. He said, I saw the whole thing on the viewing screens. He said, they showed me who did it, how it was done, why they did it, everything. And he said, and I kept insisting they don't murder popes, and he kept saying, but they did. And then he said, he gave me the reason for it. And then he said, I can tell you something else, Mr. Stevens. He said, the next pope, his successor, will be elected in the largest conclave in history, in the shortest ballot in history. He'll be elected on the third ballot. He'll be the 33rd pope, reign 33 days, die by the same hand. And I thought, Jesus, now I got something I can really test. So I made very careful notes when I got back to my room. I wrote down exactly what he said, and I brought it home with me. And I showed it to other people, and you know what happened? That next pope was elected on the biggest conclave in history because they had more cardinals than they've ever had. He was elected on the third ballot. The only pope was ever elected on the third ballot. He was not the 33rd pope the way we count popes, so that was wrong, but he died on the 33rd day by a heart failure. The same, in the Catholic dictionary, they have the same description for his heart failure. It's a heart spasm. It's a cramp in the heart. And Meier is telling me on the patio out there that they use the poison that causes the heart to cramp, goes into a cramp. And it only lasts, it evaporates out of the body in the temperature of the blood, the heat of the blood, and is gone in about 10 minutes, but it's long enough for it to kill the body. And no autopsy will detect it. They just die of a cramp in the heart. A heart seizure is what they call it. So exactly that happened. I waited 33 days. 3 days, they elected the next pope, and 30 days later, he died the same way. So that was one thing that I could test, and there's a lot of things like that. Now, I don't want to take all the time here. I've already gone too far with my time. I would kind of block this out because Michael Hessman, sitting down here, has been to Switzerland. He's met and knows all the principals. Billy's an old friend of his now, many of the other people there. And I'm going to ask Michael to come up and tell you a little bit about how he got into the case and what he thinks of it. And then we'll bring Randy Winters on, he went to Switzerland. He came to us, and he said, I'd like to go to Switzerland and meet your man. What do you think of it? We said, well, what do you want to do when you get there? He said, I'd like to study the spiritual aspects of this thing. And we liked that because we decided early on, we don't know how to deal with the spiritual aspects of it. Let's only test what we can take into a laboratory and test. We'll deal with the physical aspects. So now here's a young guy that's all inspired up and wants to go look into the spiritual aspects that we didn't like a whole lot. And we gave him all the information that we had, and called the people in Switzerland, told him he was coming. And Randy Winters went there, and he's going to tell you about what it was like to be in the group. He became a member of the group. But after Michael gets through here, you want to do it on that, or you want the lavalier?
You live in a country about 5 hours away from Switzerland. I mean, my city, Düsseldorf. It is logical that you go for investigation in the Billy Meier case. So I got interested very early in the late 1970s through the same people who informed Wendell. My good old friend Lutz Zinsberg, who unfortunately passed away in 1986, and we did a lot of correspondence about the Solzhenitsyn case, which I still follow up. And my good old friend Ilse von Jacobi, who is still alive. She is in the 70s, in the late 70s now. She lives in Munich. And they sent me the first pictures, and I magnified them, and I was very impressed because they looked like big objects. So a long time passed before I went there. And, you know, in 1979, I was 15 years old. So, okay, I didn't travel, I didn't do research. So about 4 years passed before I went there personally, and I was welcomed by Billy's family, by his wife. I spoke to his children. I spoke to eyewitnesses. And it was the beginning of many, many visits in Hinterschmidt-Rüti. There's no village called Hinterschmidt-Rüti. There's only Schmidt-Rüti. But this little farm behind Schmidt-Rüti, Hinter means behind in German, behind Schmidt-Rüti is Hinterschmidt-Rüti. So it is the mesquite of Switzerland. So I went to Hinterschmidt-Rüti, and after spending hours and hours trying to find it on a map, which was impossible, after having the bright idea that it could be close to Schmidt-Rüti, after trying to find the 4 houses of Schmidt-Rüti, I went to the Billy Meier farm. It was late at night. But fortunately, I got a warm welcome, and I had a look for with hundreds and hundreds of amazing pictures. Billy took about 1100. And if you go one time in your life to Schmidt-Rüti, it is on the road from Winterthur to Turbental in the canton of Zurich. You have a look at all these 1100 amazing UFO pictures. But what impressed me much more, because we have to be objective and we have to say that before you do such an in-depth photographic analysis, as my friend Jim Tosso did, of course, theoretically, you can fake a picture. We all know it. You can fake a picture. You can fake a UFO film. If you have the millions of Steven Spielberg, of George Lucas, you can fake it. The problem in the case of Billy Meier is he never had millions. He never even had a few thousand Schweizer Franken. He was a very poor fellow when his contacts happened, and he lived from his retirement from social support because he lost his arm. He was a handicapped person. He had his watch guard job, and he never had a lot of money. Even today, sometimes they can't publish books because they just don't have the money to bring a book out. And I'm not talking about, a quality edition like Wendell's books. I'm talking about something like, a typewritten, Xerox copied, put together writing. They don't even sometimes have the money to put this together. I mean, the people who made the big money with the Billy Meier case are sitting somewhere in the television stations or whatever, but definitely not in hinter Schmidt-Rüti. So, anyhow, what impressed me most were the many eyewitnesses. And I spoke with people who cursed Billy Meier, like Hans Jacob, who was a former member, and because he was a fanatic Christian and a fanatic, they have something they call Urgemeinde in Germany. It is something like a new revelation of Christianity. Meier's point of view, that God is just a personification of the creation, he couldn't believe. And for him, Billy Meier turned out to be something like, the Antichrist or the devil, something evil, just because he didn't follow his own thought patterns. And Hans Jakob started to follow channelers who channeled him wonderful message of Yashta command. And he turned to be more and more skeptical. And at the end of his career, he died in the 1980s, I think in 1988. After the end of his career, he had visions of Billy Meier being the devil sitting on a motorbike. And, these are the sources of information Karl Korff is quoting. And stuff like that. But even Hans Jacob, when I interviewed him, said, he's evil, but I saw a UFO. Then we have the Schutzbach brothers, which originally were fanatic followers of Meier, and fanatics always are fanatics, so they either follow you, and as long as you please them, they are fanatic followers, and in the other case, they are fanatic opponents, and even they admitted, we have seen something. We don't know how the man did it, but we have seen something. And skeptical people, critical people, who came from all over Germany in 1975, 1976, because the case was in the biggest German magazine at that time, in Quick magazine, what is like Your Life magazine, with all the pictures. Ilse von Jacobi managed it. This Quick magazine article, I think you reprinted at one time in one of your books about the Billy Meier case. Thousands of people came, and many people saw UFOs, including one man who impressed me most, who was a school director from Austria, a very intelligent, educated, elderly gentleman, Guido Moosbrugger. And this very skeptical school director went to Hinter Schmidt-Rüti, and at the very first date had a UFO encounter. And, I met Guido, and we met many times. At that time I lived in Munich. He lived 1.5 hours away in Austria. So we met many times, we talked, and we formulated the idea of making a book about the true story of Billy Meier, because there are many popularized versions. The American Billy Meier saga is very far away from the real case. Wendell gave you the real information, but if you hear stories like, at one winter day in Switzerland, the Swiss farmer Billy Meier went out on his bike to, watch his cows, when a spaceship came down from heaven. This is not true. He was not a farmer at that time. He became, a member of a farm community in 1979. He was a watch guard. He had a background of being everything from a truck driver to a snake catcher, and he had contacts in his early childhood. So, okay, but I told him, write down the true story of Billy Meier, what he did, and I arranged that he gave lectures all over America and whole life expos. So Guido told me about many experiences that he personally had about, he showed me UFO pictures he had taken by himself when Billy allowed him to go out with him. And he told me a strange story, and I spoke with other eyewitnesses. But one day, it's very similar to the story Wendell told you, one day they went, it was a rainy day, and if in Switzerland there's a rainy day, it really is a rainy day. It means it's a day where you can get stuck in the mud, Really, you need good shoes. Yeah. Boots. So anyhow, they went out, and Billy told them to wake and to pick him up, and they waited and waited and waited. It was raining cats and dogs and foxes and whatever's running around in Switzerland. And suddenly, Billy was among them, totally dry. They were wet down to their underpants, freezing, wet socks, everything. And this man appeared in the middle of them totally dry. Not even, just the first drops of rain falling on his leather jacket. His shoes were totally clean. This means he didn't even do one step, because one step in the mud means the shoes are dirty. You haven't been to Switzerland. He has. He can confirm it. So, how did he manage it? How did he do it? I spoke to people who, saw him disappearing in the forest, saw a few minutes later, brilliant, bright objects flying over, coming down, going down in the forest. After about 45 minutes, they went up again, disappearing into the sky, doing strange flight patterns. People photographed it, and then a little later, they heard the sound of the motorbike, Billy Meier coming, approaching. Oh, I had a contact. Come on, we have the landing marks. And they went into the forest, and 3 big landing marks. Each of them about 6 feet in diameter, 3 triangular pattern. How did he make it? And what all these critics forget about is that we have eyewitnesses from all the early contacts who were present. The contacts never finished. He still is in contact, even today in 1994. You have 280 or whatever, I don't know. He gave me the number. He sent me some faxes over, so I can give you the number in a moment, because I told him we will have a meeting. So don't worry, I don't read it all. I only give you the number of the contacts he had. I mean, Britt Elders is not here, so I don't have a reason to read it. But I don't explain you this joke. I don't explain this joke. No, I will not do it. I will just tell you the number, how many contacts he had. But what do we do out of it? What do we do out of it? Something happened. This thing is sure. One thing is sure. Something happened in Switzerland. Something very strange happened. Something nobody can fake. And we have pictures. We have metal samples. We have sound samples. You can fake with $1 million budget. He never had the $1 million budget, and he never had the possibility to get it back. Other people made the money, never Billy Meier. So, what happened? Can we take everything literally? All the contact messages, thousands of pages altogether, can we take them literally? Not really. There's one man, besides Wendell Stevens, who really understood the Billy Meier case, in my opinion. And this man, we all know him, Professor Jim Deardorff. Jim Deardorff wrote a brilliant analysis on the Billy Meier case, where he says that maybe the contactee scenario is just a preparation for contact and the transmission of information, the transmission of inspiration without influencing mankind, giving us the possibility to step back, giving us the possibility to evaluate, to use our intelligence, because they don't want to be our leaders. They don't want to put pressure on us. They don't want to declare the new gospel, but they want us to find the truth and to search for the truth. And maybe, thank you very much, and maybe this is the reason why we had controversial information. And the funny thing about this is, I wrote exactly what I told you in my new book, which came out in German, and Billy read it, and Billy loved it. He reprinted the chapter in my book in his magazine, so he must have, you know, we're in very good terms, even after this. So he must have the feeling that this is not totally untrue. The aliens want us to find out the truth for ourselves. So if you have the information like George Adamski is a charlatan, I don't believe it. Because I checked it out. I spoke with the eyewitnesses, Madeline Ordifer, Bill Sherwood. I just met Bill Sherwood in New York the last time. George met him too, George Bongiovanni. So I spoke to many eyewitnesses, and I know for sure Adamski had real contacts, the same type of scenario. He had real contacts. So we have to evaluate the information. We shouldn't wait for any revelation from up there. They don't want us to be listeners. They don't want us to be true believers. They don't want us to wait for a new gospel spread by the cosmic Messiah. They want us 10 minutes. No, only 2. They want us to check it out for ourselves. His clock is Pleiadian. This is supersonic speed or whatever. They want us to check it out. And that's why I tell all of you, ladies and gentlemen, before I give you the number of contacts, check it out by yourself. Don't believe nothing. Don't believe what I tell you. Don't believe what Wendell tells you. Don't believe what the Pleiadians or the Arcturians or the people from Orion or Zeta Reticuli tell you. Check it out by yourself. Because this is the first step to cosmic consciousness, to real understanding. It is the first step to becoming adults as members of a cosmic family. In the moment we are the kindergarten of the universe. And to become adults, we have to find out the truth for ourselves. And they don't want to be our leaders. And they don't want us to say, leaders, give us the orders, we follow you blindly. They are not the gurus and we are not the cult members, but we have to become people who find out the truth by ourselves. And we can only solve the global problems by ourselves, and we can only make the next step in human evolution by ourselves, and we can only find out the truth by ourselves, and they will not give us the revelation, they give us a big puzzle to trigger our intelligence, because we are intelligent enough to find it out. The number of contacts is, at this time, late 1994, 250 official contact reports are in evidence, and 250 contact reports are in the library of the FIGU, of the Free Interest Group for Ufology and Spiritual Studies in Hinterschmidt-Wilby in Switzerland. The head is Billy Meier of this group. It is a very active group in Switzerland. They collect all the information. I can invite every one of you who comes to Switzerland to go there, get information in English and German. But 250 contacts just to give a big cosmic puzzle for us to find it out. Thank you very much.
Great. Okay, we're going to switch the lavalier to Randy Winters, and let me add an interesting little note here. When Professor James Deardorff, a professor emeritus from Oregon State University at Corvallis, Washington, saw the picture book for the first time, he was impressed by not only the pictures, but the little capsule phrases, the paragraphs we put in that book, quotes from the Pleiadians. And he wrote me a letter and said, could you send me something about their ideas of Christianity or about their ideas of God? And I checked him out to see why he might be doing this, and acquaintances of his up there told me that he and his wife were born-again Christians, fundamentalists. And I thought, golly, if I send him what I know about the case, it's going to cause real trauma in his life. So I wrote him back and I said, I don't think you want to know what they think about Christianity and the Godhead. And he said, well, he wrote back again, and he said, well, tell me anyway. So I sent him a little bit. And it did disturb him, and it piqued his curiosity enough that he went out and bought copies of all the versions of the New Testament that he could find. And then he bought all of the histories that he could find on the writing of the New Testament. Then he bought concordances. Then he bought versions in the original languages. He spent 2 years studying what he already thought he believed, and he studied the history of the New Testament and found that the books were not written in the order that they are in the New Testament, a whole lot of things. And then he got down to the mysterious document, the Talmud, that the Palladians kept making reference to. And when I read the Talmud the first time, I decided I'm not going to touch this with a 10-foot pole. Sounds like another gospel. Sounds like this guy's trying to foist off another new gospel on us. That's not my bag. We'll test what we can test physically and forget the rest of it. So I sent him some more information. He began writing Switzerland and getting information around me. And he kept studying. And he was looking for contemporary events reported in the Talmud because he found very few or none in the original books of the New Testament. And he thought if he could find contemporary events reported in the Talmud, it would indicate that it might have preceded the books of the New Testament. And he ended up, having concluded his study 2 or 3 years later, publishing his Talmud or his Celestial Teachings, which was his analysis of his 3-year study now of the mysterious document. And then he wanted to publish the Talmud also, but we had a whole lot of trouble getting Meier to approve the publication of the Talmud. That it wasn't going the way he wanted it to go, but we finally did, and they come together. But Jim Deerdorf is a staunch supporter of the case. He's no longer a born-again Christian. He has a bigger and better philosophy than he ever had at that time. He felt constrained in the belief system at the time because he kind of felt bound into it. And the belief system he has now is much freer and much open. And this isn't to criticize Christianity. They do a lot of good things. I'm a Catholic myself. And I think the churches they perform a great service in our society. Now, speaking of the spiritual aspects of this thing, we decided we can't deal with it. We don't know enough about it. But a young man came to us one time, said he wanted to go over there and study the spiritual aspects. Could we get him an introduction so he could talk right to Billy? And we made a couple of telephone calls, and Randy Winters went over there to see what he could find out about what they thought and believed. So with that, we got him suited up. Let me bring Randy Winters on. He has written his own book on the case now, and he'll carry it from here.
Well, I think I'm wired up. Am I on?
Over his head, a big helmet with lights and wires and things going into it, lights on it. And in a few minutes' time, they inculcated a vast amount of knowledge in his head, just pumped in somehow into his subconscious mind. And then after that happened, triggering events would awaken realization of some of these things that he knew, but he didn't know how he knew them. So with the knowledge that was instilled in his mind, he was able to attend school, although he attended very seldom because he was the poorest, among the poorest of the boys in the school. And because he didn't have shoes and he didn't have new clothes and things for school, the more affluent boys picked on him, and they would set him up as the butt of pranks. They would pull a joke on the teacher, make it look like Meier did it, and he would frequently get punished for it. And the time came when this seemed to be a regular thing, and the boys took pride in getting it over on Meier. He began to think, well, if the teacher can't see through this, and the boys are getting away with it, then I really am superior to them because I know both. I know they're doing it, and I know the teacher doesn't understand this, and he'd take his punishment and say nothing. But because of this, he didn't go to school very often. And he got to where in his 4th year, I think he only attended school something like 26 days, and in the 5th year, 17 or something like that, and 5th grade. And they passed him out of the 5th grade to get him out of there because they regarded as a troublemaker, and he never went back to school after that. So he doesn't have much of a formal education, but he has a pretty good mind for any of those that have read the stuff that he translates from the contact notes. And he became, because he left school early, of course, the truant officers were looking for him too. He went to work on a farm, and he drove a tractor. He did a number of things. Because of his reputation in the school, it kind of rubbed off, and he didn't have the best reputation in the town of Bulak, where he was raised and lived. And the time came when they thought that they'd lock him up because he was the troublemaker in town, and they took him to the local mental hospital. He escaped from there the first day by using simple things in his cell, and they picked him back up again, put him back in there, and put him in an isolation cell on the second floor with a high window, and locked him in. And it only took him 2 days to figure out how to, with things available in the cell, to make a way to loosen the bars and get out through the window. And he let himself out the window and dropped 2 stories to the ground, injured his ankle, and made his way to the Rhone River, or the Rhine River that went past there. As soon as you heard them starting to search for him, they got dogs and they chased him.
One may say something to some of us. It says something to me for sure. Cal Korff had, at least up until the last week or so, been talking like he was going to come, even when we changed the format to a retrospective, because without the other side officially accepting the debate challenge, why we couldn't set it up in that kind of format. But Cal Korff also had a change of heart in the last few days, and he cited a pressing schedule for the reason he could not be here. But an event happened a couple of days before we got a declination from him. The television program Sightings is also doing a report on the Meier case, and I believe that will be aired, if it's not this Sunday, maybe the following, but very quickly now. And Cal Korff and Jim Della Tosa, this Sunday, thank you. Jim Della Tosa, who was also scheduled to be a part of the retrospective tonight, and Cal Korff actually were in kind of a mini debate format during the filming for Sightings. And I'm told by people that were on those crews and by the producer of that program that Cal Korff literally got blown out of the water. Literally. And my suspicion is that this is the real reason that he may not be with us tonight. So, a brief word about Jim Della Tosa. Jim was the man that did the original photographic analysis on the Meier photos and negatives. And unfortunately, he had planned to be with us tonight, but I do know that for a fact that he has a major negotiation going on with Lucasfilms, Industrial Light and Magic right now, and some other very big Hollywood players on a couple of projects. And this is, of course, his livelihood now. Regretfully, he is not with us tonight, but we do have his sincere apologies to convey to all of you that he's not here. He is, of course, the head of the UFO band who will be performing for us in concert on Saturday night. So you all will get a chance to meet Jim. And if any of you want to talk to him personally about the photographic analysis on the Meier photos, I'm certain that he will be equally receptive to speaking to any of you on an individual basis. So listen, I've talked much longer than I should have here, but I wanted to give you some background on this whole evening. And right now I'm going to bring Colonel Wendell Stevens up, and please give him a great round of applause.
Can you hear me okay? First of all, I want to invite them to thank you all for coming to this. He was a representative in that group for a meeting with those human beings who said they came from the Pleiades. Now, they didn't tell him initially this. This came out in the discussions later. But they chose Enrique Castillo Rincon to represent the group, and he followed the instructions, went out into a remote area south of Colombia, about 12 miles south of Bogota, Colombia, and met human beings who got out of a big spaceship and talked to him. They invited him aboard, and he went, and he had several subsequent visits aboard the spacecraft. That's another entire story in itself, and that began in the middle 60s, also before the contacts with Billy Meier began. So Those are 3 cases. There are a couple more that I am aware of, and 2 of them began before the Meier case. So we can't say that they are copying Billy Meier. We might say that he's copying them, but he was not there, and the information on 2 of those cases was never published. So the thing of interest here is, when did it all begin? It looks to me like the Meier case didn't start with the Pleiades. It started with another group that identified him when he was, actually, there's evidence that it started when he was a baby, when he was dying of pneumonia in the crib, and he was given up for dead. The doctor left, said he won't live until morning. And miraculously, he was breathing well in the morning, and he had almost fully recovered. Later, the Pleiadians mentioned their saving his life at that time. He didn't know anything about this, of course. And when they mentioned it to him, he went back and asked his parents if there was something strange about the early days of his birth, and they told him yes, he had a miraculous survival. So that was the first clue that he got that there was direct interference in his life. At about the age of 8, there was a direct contact where he and his father saw an object pass, a disc-shaped object, pass at low level over a field where they were working. He asked his father about it, and his father said, "Oh, it must be one of those new German weapons." They live right across the border from Germany. They could see the bombers bombing the city right across, and they wrote it off. But he thought that that couldn't be the case because it was huge. It was a large disc flying at low level. Then later, a few years later, when he was about 10 or 11 years old, now he's seen things in the sky ever since. He got to where he could look up, and he could see them in the daylight in the deep sky. He could look through the blue and see them up there, and he knew they were there. And then he saw them at night also. Then another close approach, and a pear-shaped metallic, silvery gold metallic craft landed in a field in front of him. The door opened, and an old man got out and invited him to come aboard. And he did at that time, and when he got in the ship, he noticed that they took off because the ground receded from them, but he wasn't afraid. The old man talked to him very gently, and he set him down in a chair there, in a seat, put a helmet of some kind over meeting tonight. Bob said the thing changed quite a bit, so I threw my prepared lecture and notes out, and I'm going to do this extemporaneously. So I'm going to start from the beginning of the case and go from there and tell you details that have never been published anywhere and events that happened in sequential order as best I can remember them. So with that, Pleiades almost seems like an unpleasant word today, the way it's abused and bandied around and misused, but it's a very important word. The Pleiades are a very prominent star group in our history and mythology. Everything mentions the Pleiades someplace or other. It's in all of the mythological lore of all of the countries of the world, as a matter of fact. So, did this Meier case that is so controversial, did it start with Billy Meier? No. His case didn't start there, and there were other cases of visitors, human beings, coming here from the Pleiades before Mr. Meier's case with them started in 1975. In 1958, there was a man named Lloyd Zerbes up at St. Cloud, Minnesota, who began having contacts with beings who said they came from the Pleiades, and his contacts went on until about 4 years ago when he died of a cancer. And they went on all that time, and these Pleiadians conveyed a lot of information to him. He never wanted to get any public attention. They gave him technical data. They discussed physics and science, many sciences with him, very much like they did with the ones in Switzerland with Billy Meier. The Pleiadians that were visiting Minnesota were not the same Pleiadians as the one visiting Meier. Now, the word Pleiadians was our reference to that group. They have another name for themselves. We call them Pleiadians because they said they came from a star group that we call the Pleiades. Very apt name. The same thing with the others. The others came from the Pleiades, but they came from different star systems in the Pleiades. When we finally tied down the source of the Pleiadians visiting Switzerland, they said they came from a star that we call Taygeta. It's about the 4th brightest star in the 7 bright stars that make up the Pleiades. The case in Minnesota in that case, the Pleiadians said that they came from a star group that around the major star that we call Alcyone. There's another Pleiadian group that said they came from a star, or human beings that come from what we call the Pleiades, said they came from a system around the star Merope. There was a Pleiadian case in South America involving an attorney, Enrique Castillo Rincon, who participated in a metaphysical study group, and beginning first with telepathic contact and then going on from there with some sightings. And then they were invited telepathically to send a rep to choose.
And not only has he had an interest since a very early age, but from the very beginning, the most wonderful and unique thing about Wendell is that he has been willing to share the knowledge that he learns with everybody and anybody who asks him. And this is so wonderful and so special and so rare. And tonight, he is coming to share a little bit of this knowledge with all of us again, yet again. You know, I think Wendell has probably forgotten more things than most of us will ever know about this subject. And I don't, I mean that in the best possible way. And it's a rare treat tonight because he's going to talk on a subject that, in truth, for the last, 8 or 10 years anyway, it's a subject that he has been reluctant to continue talking about. He says, the Meier case, the Pleiadian case, that's old news. We did that investigation, years ago. I've said everything I have to say on it. And that's pretty much where he's left it, and he's moved on to newer stuff. Now, there are generations of people that are now interested in the phenomena, and many of them really don't know much about the Billy Meier case. And in addition, there's now a big move afoot to debunk it. Oh, yeah. Yes, there is. Well, yeah, there always has been, but there's another new, fresh, orchestrated attempt at, I would say, almost professionally debunking the Meier case. And two of the people behind this position, that the Meier case is a hoax, are Cal Korff and Glenn Hoyen. Thank you, Wendell. Drew a blank there. Yeah, Cal Korff and Glenn Hoyen. Now, I want to let everybody here know that both of these gentlemen were invited to be a part of this retrospective. As a matter of fact, in the beginning, I had an idea for this really to be more of a structured debate between the current generation of debunkers and those people that were really there on scene, those people that really did the work, etc. But the other side, if we can, the debunking side, for whatever reason, is not here. Now, that alone